So hello, everybody. We're about to start with our event today, or this evening, or morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the event, a small conference on small modular reactors. And the subtitle is Small Modular Reactors, the Estonian Need or Distraction. I am Madis Vasser. I am a board member of Estonian Green Movement, which is a member of Friends of the Earth Europe and also CEE Bankwatch, among other organizations. And the reason for this topic tonight is very simple. The topic has been discussed in Estonia in recent years quite actively, and we wish, as an environmental organization, that the general public would be very aware of the topic and have a balanced discussion on the issues of small modular nuclear reactors. And just a little heads up, what is a small modular reactor? It's typically conventionally these reactors that are about 300 megawatts in power or less. And today's evening will be basically in two sections. So we will have 4 short presentations and then a panel discussion between some panelists and some people from outside. And since the knowledge about this topic is currently rather low in Estonia, we asked some international experts to come and share their expertise. And this is why the event is held in English, with translation later being available in the recording. So, and the event is being broadcast on Facebook. So do post your questions that you have for the participants in the comment section on Facebook, and we will do our best to ask them. If you need, you can write the questions in Estonian, and we will do our very best to translate and then ask them to the speakers. And now, without further delay, we already delayed the beginning a bit. Allow me to introduce you to our first speaker, who is MV Ramana, who is the Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security with the Liu Institute for Global Issues at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada. He is a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. Also, he has authored and co-edited several books related to nuclear energy. And his research interests are in the broad areas of international security and energy supply, with a particular focus on topics related to nuclear energy and fissile materials. And today, he will be talking shortly about SMR financing in general, but also some other parts in between. And due to the large time difference between Canada and Estonia, this first presentation will be pre-recorded. So you will see a recorded message and me asking some recorded questions in the end. So for this first presentation, there will be no question round, but I did my best to ask some critical questions. And now, if I can, I will share the video, which we will see. And it runs about 20 minutes.
Thank you again for inviting me to speak to you about small modular reactors. I will start by actually talking a little bit about what proponents for small modular reactors say about these nuclear power plants and why they support them, before going on to trying and explaining why these may not work the way that they are supposed to be working. And the term that I like to use for them is happy talk. This was something that a member of the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission told me about how the people who are trying to evaluate new nuclear power plant designs designate what proponents of these reactors, the people who are developing these reactors, say. So when they talk about it, it's all great and nice. And in the same fashion, when proponents of small modular reactors talk about it, for example, Fermi Energia, they talk about how it can be built quicker, it uses less materials, and it uses less fuel. And then they probably sometimes talk about how it is very safe. And again, that there are not going to be no accidents with small modular reactors. and also the other well-known problem with nuclear power, namely the waste that it produces is not a problem. So in Estonia, I believe there is talk about using something called geological repositories using deep drilling, and I will talk a little bit about that towards the very end. So these are the kinds of claims that you see being made about small modular reactors, also that they are quick to develop. And if you look at the historical record, you will see that none of this is really going to be true, but I will get to that later. So the question to be really asked is, any good nuclear power plant ought to have a bunch of good characteristics. In particular, we would like the reactor to be safe in the sense of not causing accidents. We would like it to produce as little radioactive waste as possible, because radioactive waste is very difficult to deal with. We'd like it not to contribute to nuclear weapons proliferation, and we would like it to generate cheap electricity. Now, if you try to look at whether these claims will actually be realized, the simple answer is no. All these properties cannot be realized in a single design. And this comes from a technical examination of the properties of different kinds of reactors. So as I mentioned, you would like reactors to produce less waste, be cheap, be safe, and be proliferation resistant. And if you think about what each of these desired properties will require of the technical nature of the design, you will find that they are pulling in very different directions. For example, if you want to reduce the amount of nuclear waste that you produce, then you need to use fast neutron reactors. And fast neutron reactors means that they will have a propensity for certain kinds of accidents called hypothetical core disassembly accidents, and also that they will require more fissionable material, either plutonium or highly enriched uranium, or even medium high assay low enriched uranium, all of which is sort of more prone towards nuclear proliferation. The more important thing to note is that all small modular reactors, by their very nature, small, means that they are going to produce much less power. So in this sense, you might actually go back to think about what are the claims that were made by Fermi Energia and other people, saying that these are going to require less material, they're going to produce less waste, and so on. You have to ask yourself the question, it is not about less material, but is it less material per unit of power that is produced? Because you should remember that a small reactor also produces much less electricity. So if you want all your electricity to be met by the same amount of nuclear power, then obviously the amount of material has to be scaled to the amount of power that's produced. And so in the case of cost, the small reactors by their very nature are going to be more expensive. And the reason is that if you think about a nuclear power plant that produces 10 times as much electricity will not require 10 times as much concrete, or 10 times as much weldings, or 10 times as many workers. So you actually gain as you go to larger and larger reactors. And this is the reason why nuclear power moved from small reactors that it used to build in the early days of the nuclear era to building larger and larger reactors. So conversely, when you go to smaller reactors, then you're going to lose out on these economies of scale. So small reactors are going to be more expensive, and nuclear power is already very expensive. The other thing that small size means is that it will produce more spent fuel, you require more uranium fuel, and produce more waste, and so on and so forth, simply because a smaller reactor is going to be technically less efficient at using all the neutrons that are produced. The challenge of cost is particularly important for nuclear power because unlike, let's say, airplanes or cars or something, there are many ways of generating electricity. And so to compare the economics of any source of electricity, you have to compare it with other ways of generating electricity. And if you look at electricity from small modular reactors, these are costs that are being shown in the case of the United States. What you find is that there are far cheaper sources of electricity. Primarily wind and solar energy have become far cheaper in the last decade. And if you look at current costs for large reactors in the United States, they are roughly about 4 times as expensive in terms of per kilowatt hour. and about 10 times as expensive per unit of electricity capacity. So nuclear power is already very expensive, and small reactors are going to be even more expensive. So it's very unlikely that they will ever be able to compete. The second thing to note is that if you look at the experience of nuclear power around the world, initial cost estimates, what the proponents or the advocates of a nuclear power plant or the developers of a reactor design will tell you, are almost invariably wrong. The final cost is going to be much higher. One study showed that 97% of nuclear projects had exceeded the budget. 175 out of 180 projects they looked at, and all of them had a cost over of 117%, so more than double the initial cost estimate. And they took about 64% time more than projected. And this trait has been also demonstrated in the case of small modular reactors, in particular the new scale reactor that has been generated, that's been likely to be the first SMR built in the United States, has been increasing consistently in cost, starting from when it was about expected to be about $1,700 per kilowatt when it was first proposed, to around $4,200 per kilowatt, which then sort of went up to about $8,500 per kilowatt when actually the cost of the entire project was considered. And this can be compared with other SMRs being built around the world in Russia and Argentina, which are much higher. The other thing to note is that people who are pushing small modular reactors often say, oh, these are very flexible. They can be used to back up the variability of the output of renewables, in particular wind and solar. The problem with that is whether or not it is technically true, and we can get into that in the Q&A if you're interested. But in terms of economics, it is going to make the project more expensive simply because you're expending the same amount of capital cost, but producing less amount of electricity. And that is going to drive up the cost. So SMRs are going to become even more uneconomical in the event that you use to back up variable renewables. And the last thing to say about the past experience has been that SMRs have been always talked about being built in very quick time scale, and in actual fact, none of them. So this is a slide from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, a person from that who spoke at a seminar back in 2008. And that person had predicted that many of the reactors that were small modular reactors that the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission was considering at that stage in the late 2000s, were all going to be ready for construction by 2020. In actual fact, not a single one of them has actually moved anywhere near construction. The closest is New Scale, which was supposed to have come online by 2015, but in actual fact is probably going to be only in 2020. I now want to 2030, I'm sorry. I now want to come to the point about safety. So the thing to remember is that small modular reactors are nuclear power plants, and which means that they can undergo accidents. A number of small reactors that were constructed in the past have had accidents. I live in Canada, for example. In Canada, the NRX reactor suffered a major meltdown way back in 1952, and then again in 1958, and then similarly in Windscale and so on and so forth. And the reason that reactors have these properties have been studied by academics. Chick Pero, a sociologist, for example, talked about two properties that he called interactive complexity and tight coupling, which are essential features of any nuclear reactor, as well as a bunch of other hazardous technology. And he showed that they inevitably lead to serious accidents. Inevitably doesn't mean that it's going to happen immediately. It just means, or quickly, it just means that it will happen at some point and you can never rule it out. And the challenges to deal with such hazardous technologies have also been studied, and they suggest that the organizations that are to manage such technologies are very stringent demands, and these are very hard to meet. The experience with small modular reactors so far has been more of the same. I wanted to start by reminding that small reactors aren't new. The United States, for example, built a number of reactors in the early years that can qualify as small reactors under today's label. And one example was built in a place called Elk River, which was shut down in 1968 simply because it was not economical. There was the first time there was a repair that had to be done. The entire plant was shut down because the operator felt it was not making any money, right? And this is the lesson to be learned about for other places which are looking at these designs and saying, oh, this looks good, maybe we should build one of them. The problem is you'll spend billions of dollars building one of them, and then after a few years it shuts down and you don't recoup any of the money back. In terms of all the reactors that are being constructed today, the SMRs, you find that all of them are either delayed or performing poorly. So in Argentina and China, the reactors that were projected to be starting in a few years have all taken much longer. The Chinese high temperature reactor, for example, has taken roughly twice as long as it's supposed to have taken. The Russian KLT-40S, a floating nuclear power plant, was construction of it started in 2007. It was projected to start operations in October 2010, but it actually got commissioned only in May 2020. So it's more than, it was supposed to be constructed in 3 years. It took 13 years. And it has not been operating particularly well, partly because of the remote location. And other proposed designs have also been delayed in the case of India, in the case of Russia, and in the case of the United States. The NuScale reactor, as I mentioned, was projected to start generating electricity by 2015, 2016. But the current estimates are that it will be maybe by 2029, 2030, provided a number of problems that have been identified about the safety of that reactor are addressed on time. And it's very, very unlikely that this is going to actually happen. Finally, there are a number of countries that have expressed an interest in small modular reactors for the kinds of reasons that might also be applicable to Estonia. Primarily the fact that they have small grids which cannot bear or which cannot deal with a large reactor, right? So Ghana is one country like that. Jordan is another country. Indonesia is a different kind of a country. It is a large country with a large population and a large electrical load, but it's composed of numerous islands, many of which are not connected to the main grid. And so Indonesia was also considering small modular reactors. But I used to be in Princeton earlier, and in our team, we sort of looked at all of these cases in some detail, and we found that in none of those cases, actually, these countries were going ahead with small modular reactors, because once they started looking into what is involved in that, it made no sense to go into a small modular reactor. If you're going to go ahead and build a nuclear power plant, what some of these countries have decided is we may as well build a big plant, or we don't build nuclear at all, right? So that's the decision that many of them have done. I just want to say a word about nuclear waste. I mean, the problem with nuclear power, as many people know, is that it produces radioactive waste that remain hazardous for thousands and thousands of years. In particular, one of the things that people have in Estonia seem to be talking about is the so-called deep borehole disposal. And it seems on paper like a great idea. It's like fracking. You drill a deep hole, and then you drill sideways, and you can put it there. It doesn't work so easily, right? My colleague Alison McFarlane and her postdoctoral fellows, Lindsay Krall, who have looked at this in some detail, and they find that it actually doesn't work the way it is advertised at all. So that's something to remember. So let me conclude by just saying that, all small modular reactors have various technological challenges. None of them can solve all the problems that are confronting nuclear power, in particular, the challenge of safety, the challenge of waste, the challenge of proliferation, and the challenge of economics. So even under the best circumstances, they will be producing expensive electricity and will take a long time to develop. Let me stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
And thank you for a very good overview. I do have some questions. First one is really technical, really. You had this slide of the costs of the NuScale going up. So what's the source for this? Because I couldn't find it in the slide.
Yeah, so this is actually from a report that I produced last year, which I can send you, and I'm happy to have you share it with everybody. Basically, these are costs that have been made by NuScale as well as UAMPS, which is the Utah Association of Municipal Power Suppliers, which is supposed to be the first client for a NuScale reactor, right? So these are official sources. It's not numbers that I make up. I've just been compiling it over different years.
Leading on from that, you mentioned that that these small reactors are small, but at the same time, we know that you can due to the modularization, you can actually add many reactors in a single site. In Estonia, there has been talks that ideally these power plants would have, let's say, 4 reactors, so totaling up to 1,200 megawatts. So wouldn't this solve the power output issue?
Yes, that's a great question. So you will be able to reduce the per unit cost by building multiple reactors. Okay, but precisely by the same token, you're going to be reducing the safety of the plant, right? If you build just one small reactor, you have only a certain amount of radioactive material, you only produce a certain amount of heat, and you can try to deal with it. But the moment you have 4 reactors, you have 4 times as much radioactive material on the same site, right? That is one problem. The second problem is that once you place a number of reactors close to each other, then what is happening in one reactor can affect what is happening in other reactors. We saw this in the case of Fukushima, where once one reactor melted down, the radiation levels were so high in the neighboring reactors that workers could not be working there trying to control and prevent those reactors from melting down, right? So the moment you go to multiple reactors, some of the advantages of small size actually go down, right? You gain in cost, but then you lose in safety, right? The whole idea of going to smaller reactors rather than, instead of building 1,200 megawatt reactor, the idea of building 300 megawatt reactors is that it is going to be safer and it is going to produce less waste and so on. But all of those advantages go away the moment you start building 4 of them or multiple numbers of them.
You mentioned that the licensing time is rather long for nuclear reactor designs, but at the same time in Estonia, we have this Tallinn declaration that says that we are, or the industry is aiming for harmonization. So whatever is licensed in the States can instantly be used also in Estonia. So in your long experience, do you see this happening? Is there any hope for such a development?
So yes and no. If it can happen if Estonian authorities decide to do that, right? But is it actually wise for them to do that, right? Estonia is not the United States, it's not Canada, right? Any safety analysis that has to be conducted will have to take specific local conditions into consideration, right? A safety of a reactor is not like trying to understand the safety of this iPhone that I'm holding up, right? The iPhone is pretty much the same whether it's sitting here or sitting in India or sitting in Australia, right? But a nuclear power plant is not like that because it depends on the geology, it depends on the local flooding levels, all kinds of different factors. It also depends, as I mentioned earlier, how safe a reactor is operated or any kind of hazardous facility is operated depends on the organizational culture, right? So how do you make an assumption about organizational culture without actually seeing the organization in action, right? So, you can, people will tell you that, in certain parts of the world, people drive much more rashly compared to other parts of the world. Other parts of the world, they're very safe. They wear their seatbelts. They never go above the speed limit. There are other places where that will never be done, right? So can you make an assessment about the safety of a car without knowing that, right? All of this I'm just pointing out is that if Estonia as a country, as a polity, wants to make a decision about should we build one of these or not, they have to have their own regulators who are answerable to the Estonian people to look at this and decide whether it's safe or not, right? So that any Estonian government can look people in the face and be honest when they say, yes, we have looked very hard at this and we think it is safe. If you're going to rely on the Canada or the United States who are doing it, they're not responsible for the Estonian people. They're responsible to their people at best, right? And one can even question whether they're actually even responsible to their people when they sort of seem to be so much in collusion with the nuclear industry, but leave aside that point, right? So can Estonia do this? In principle, yes, but is it going to be wise? The answer is no.
The final question, maybe a quick one, is that you talked about financing. Could this small modular reactor be built with purely private money?
In principle, yes, but in practice, no. All right. If you think about the cost of one of these reactors, so there's 3 sets of costs which are involved, right? Most of the costs so far that have been spent on small modular reactors have been in just trying to develop the design. Okay. To develop the design of a small modular reactor, the initial design is not something which is very difficult to come up with. If I have a few graduate students and a big supercomputer and a few $100,000 to pay my stipend for my students, they can come up with a new reactor design. But to try and translate that little paper design or that computer design into one that can actually be built, where a good regulator who will ask difficult questions, what will this reactor do when there's a fire? What happens if there's a flood, et cetera, et cetera? If I have to answer them properly, I'll have to spend a lot of money and a lot of time going to laboratories, doing experiments, right? That's another huge amount of cost. Then finally, there's the cost of building the actual reactor, both the cost of the concrete and the steel and so on and so forth, and also the financing costs, the cost of the money that you're going to be borrowing, et cetera, right? So in all, you can say the cost of one of these small modular reactors is probably going to be of the order of $5 to $10 billion, okay? If you're going to go from scratch, right? $5 billion, let's say. Can somebody spend $5 billion in the private market? Yes, there are people who have $5 billion. Bill Gates, for example, has more than $5 billion. He can easily build one of these things. But does he do that? He doesn't. He spends $10 million, $20 million on this company called TerraPower. And then he goes to Washington, he goes to Beijing, and he says, please give me some more money, right? And they give him, okay, here you have $80 million as a grant. And then they give another $1.2 billion. And that's how Bill Gates is trying to build his reactor. What does that tell you? He does not want to spend his own money because it's very risky to build one of these things, right? So private markets can in principle build it, but nobody will want to bear that risk. Unless somebody, you know, someone who has such a lot of money, then I can have a lot of things to sell that person.
So there's still some bit of fate involved all the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
So yes, we are back into the live mode. And now again, the participants and the public can be very, very active and think up different questions as well, because the next speaker will be live. And just to introduce, we will have Dr. Paul Dorfman, who is an associate fellow at Science Policy Research Unit at University of Sussex. Also, he's the founder of the Nuclear Consulting Group and a member of the Irish Government Environmental Protection Agency Radiation Protection Advisory Committee. Also a member of the International Nuclear Risk Assessment Group. And Paul has served as secretary to the UK government's Scientific Advisory Committee examining radiation risks from internal emitters. Also, he led the European Environmental Agency response to the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And he has been appointed expert to the European Economic and Social Committee and has served as advisory to the UK Ministry of Defence Nuclear Submarine Dismantling Project. And this is just to name a few of his titles. And his key interests include nuclear policy, energy futures, environmental risk, pollution control, participatory democracy, and public involvement. And today he will be talking about the relationship between nuclear energy and climate change, which we have heard from some aspects, but maybe not from other aspects. And I will be sharing the screen and Paul will be doing the talking. So over to you.
Hello. Thank you very much for involving me, and perhaps we can get on to the first slide.
Just a second.
Okay, that's just the title. So the next one, please. Right. As we all know, climate change is here now. You know, for guys like me and others, of course, you know, we've known this for 30 years or so, but and one takes great encouragement, in fact, by the idea that people are really beginning to take it seriously. The problem is, of course, that widespread wildfire and flooding has focused minds on the recent IPCC report, which confirms, you know, perhaps unsurprisingly, that as the world heats, ice stored at the poles and in the glaciers melt and sea levels rise. Next slide. So all of the models, and I think, you know, to anybody who's been looking at it, we've seen over the last year and a half, all of the climate models are running hot. There's been a step change in our understanding about climate sensitivity and polar ice melt rate. As a part of this, it seems very clear that sea level rises significantly faster than previously thought. And along with that, of course, comes more frequent and destructive storm surge, which we'll come back to later, severe precipitation and flooding. Next slide, please. So we're coming to the age of unplanned obsolescence, where, as we all know and understand, rare extreme events today will become normalized, will become the norm in the future. And what that means, of course, is that existing planned risk mitigation measures are becoming increasingly obsolete, if not already obsolete. Next slide, please. Key to all this is coastal flooding assessment. It's slightly more difficult to do inland, but we're going to come to that later. It's clear, it's obvious, that sea level rise will cause significant modifications in high tide and wave setup involving near shore tide surge. So data on coastal change from mean sea level variability, tide, atmospheric surge, and wave setup is critical for coastal flooding assessment. Next slide, please. And this is really what's key. Because when one looks at IPCC, when one looks at all the other kinds of models, one sees a certain step change in sea level rise. So sea level rise is thought to continue as a sort of a step change, incremental step change. It's thought, but the near-term risk, the real risk, near-term and for the next few decades, will come from storm surge. Now, what is storm surge? Well, when climate-driven storms combine with strong winds and low atmospheric pressure, this results in a local increase in sea level known as storm surge. So basically what happens is basically the sea rises and it just moves inland. And we've seen this happen quite recently. Next slide, please. Now, according to the Global Extreme Sea Level Analysis, and by the way, at the end of this discussion, I'll give you references to two reports, two NCG reports, which rehearse this discussion and have all of the background references, peer-reviewed references to the data that I'm presenting today. So it's not just the height of the rise in sea level that's important. It's the increase in storm surge that is absolutely critical, and especially critical to coastal infrastructure, i.e. nuclear infrastructure by the coast. Now, in terms of the Global Extreme Sea Level Analysis, the report clearly states that the magnitude and the frequency of extreme sea levels, which is a combination of factor of mean sea level rise, tide, and storm-induced increase. So it's a sort of negative synergistic combination, which cause storm surge and hence catastrophic flooding has accelerated, has increased worldwide. Next slide, please. So in terms of coastal flooding, the European Environment Agency, the EEA, has mapped, and again, you know, all of these references can be found in the two reports at the end of the discussion, which will be accessible, I understand, after these presentations, has mapped the scale of climate impact that, for example, Europe will face. What their models predict is that, and one can look at this in terms of uncertainty, mean sea level rise will be in the range of 1.5 to 2.5 meters within the century. So that's quite a large range, and that's obviously dependent on whole sets of other factors. But I think there's one thing that we can all agree on, is that we will be seeing significantly increased coastal flooding. And it, by the way, in terms of inland, which is another issue that needs to be addressed in terms of nuclear, because nuclear, of course, is situated by large bodies of water simply for cooling. This is where you find nuclear, by the coast or inland in rivers or in large bodies of water. It has to be situated in these at-risk areas. Next slide, please. Well, the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is this sort of the overseeing body for the US in terms of nuclear, they state, and again, there's references for all of this, that 55 US nuclear sites have already experienced flooding hazard beyond their design base. The US Army War College say that nuclear power facilities are at high risk of temporary or permanent closure due to climate threats, with 60% of US nuclear capacity vulnerable to sea level rise, severe storms, and cooling water shortages. Next slide, please. The Pentagon say that 79 military bases, this is nuclear military bases, will be affected by rising sea levels and frequent flooding, including 23 nuclear installations, strategic radar stations, nuclear command centers, missile test ranges, and ballistic missile defense sites, 7 of which store nuclear weapons. And again, there's references to all of this in the documents at the end of this discussion. Now, this has played out in real time recently, when the nerve center of the US nuclear deterrent was submerged by floodwater, with recovery of the base costing over $1 billion. Next slide, please. Now, what shocked me, and this is quite some time ago, the UK Institute of Mechanical Engineers is a sort of, you know, the par example, the best, you know, institute in the UK of mechanical engineering. These are people who really know their business. And what struck me way back in 2008 is that they published a document called something like, and again, there's reference to this, Climate Change, Adapting to the Inevitable. This is back in 2008. And in 2008, they said existing UK coastal nuclear installations. And what's important about this is together with their radioactive waste stores, because of course, along with the nuclear installation, you're going to have the spent fuel, which has to be set aside to cool, and the other forms, the intermediate and the rest of it. So along with the radioactive waste stores, are vulnerable, this is back in 2008, to sea level rise, flooding, storm surge, and nuclear islanding, when the nuclear station is completely surrounded by water. And perhaps alarmingly, sorry to laugh about this, but it's sort of, you know, quite shocking. The UK Institute of Mechanical Engineers say that some UK coastal nuclear infrastructure may need to be relocated or abandoned. Relocated or abandoned. Now they said, and they said that in the longer term. Now this is back in 2008. We're now into 2021. Climate models have ramped. You know, things are very different from back in 2008. So the future does seem to be getting closer and closer to us. Next slide, please. So as discussed, we're talking about both coastal and inland risk here. Okay, 41% of all nuclear power plants worldwide operate on the seacoast. And one imagines that in terms of Estonia, that's the plan, or that's the supposition, making them vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge induced flooding. However, inland nuclear plants face severe wildfire with episodic flooding alternating with low river flow and raised water temperature, the latter impacting on reactor cooling capacity and hence viability. And that's not simply the problem about low river flow and water temperature for the inlet nuclear plant, but it's also the accepting water that the nuclear plant would have to disperse to. Next slide, please. So the unfortunate reality is that nuclear's unique selling point, the USP, that it will help with climate, it sits within a deeper reality, that nuclear is, unfortunately, on the front line of climate change and not in a good way. Worldwide, more than 500 million people live within 80-kilometer radius of at least one operating nuclear power plant. 20 million live within a 16K radius. And one imagines what may happen if any sort of climate change induced event happens, and there's some form of radiation release associated with that. At least 100 nuclear power stations have been built just a few meters above sea level and will be increasingly threatened by flooding, accelerating sea level rise, and once again, storm surge. Next slide, please. So we come down to questions of operational safety, security, and viability. Now, I and everybody, especially IPCC, have been worried in the last year and a half. I mean, the data has ramped in terms of what we understand about climate. However, peer-reviewed published data point to, without any question, a much quicker and greater sea level rise, faster, harder, more destructive storm and storm surge. And what this does is bring into question the operational security, the safety, and the viability of what has to be low-lying coastal and inland nuclear infrastructure. Nuclear infrastructure must be located by large bodies of water to get the cooling and to discharge. Therefore, they're reduced to these geographical locations. Next slide, please. Now, I'm just going to present a few flood risk maps, climate central flood risk maps, which seem to be, you know, as good as any other. I've compared them with UK University of Liverpool ARCO's nuclear flood risk maps, and what I've seen, or what can be seen, is that the two coalesce largely. So there's a form of sort of data confirmation here. However, okay, what they are, they're deploying representative sea level projections aligned with conservative, i.e. median IPCC findings. The climate central flood risk maps represent plausible threat indicators which require deeper investigations. Models are uncertain. Models are what they are models. However, since the maps are not based on physical storm and flood simulations, the risk from extreme flood events may be more. And if there's one thing that we've understood about climate change, the risk does tend to ramp, because in this case, erosion, intensity of storm, storm surge, and inland flooding haven't yet been taken into consideration with these maps. So next slide, please. Now, this is Dungeness nuclear power plant, just recently closed. As you can see, look at the shingle. One can imagine it's actually quite low-lying. It has to be decommissioned and swiftly. Next slide, please. And that, the red, is the below annual flood level, let's say at 2050. You could argue 2035, 2040. So once a year, this is what could be expected. And if you're looking for the nuclear power plant, if you look at sort of the bobble at the end of that sort of peninsula, that's where the nuclear power plant is. And the red here is below annual flood, exactly, thank you very much. Below annual, sorry to laugh about this, but it's, you know, slightly below annual flood level at, let's say, 2050. Next slide, please. Now, this is a picture of Sizewell B. Sizewell B is the most recent operational nuclear plant in the UK. EDF there are plans to build yet another at Sizewell C, just to the right, as it were, to the north of Sizewell B. But as you can see, there's the shingle, there's the coast. You can't quite see the sea here, but there are shots of Sizewell and Sizewell C with the waves sort of crashing in. Now go to the map, the next one, please. And this, right in the middle of the red, and the red is below annual flood level, say at 2050, okay? Right in the middle of that, almost entirely surrounded by that red, are the nuclear plant, that Sizewell B, the proposed Sizewell C. So one can say with reasonable certainty that this nuclear power plant will be subject to nuclear islanding at least once a year by at least 2050, if not before. Next slide, please. There's various discussions about Estonia. Estonia doesn't look to be as much subject to flooding as the UK. However, one needs to return to the discussion about storm and storm surge here in terms of risk. Pakri Islands have been named as one of the potential sites for nuclear. There have been others, but let's just take this as an example. There's a shot of the islands, an aspect of the islands. Next slide, please. And the red is below annual flood level 2050. Now, I have no idea where the stations are, if they were to be built on Pakri Islands, where they would be situated. But this gives you some idea about the potential vulnerability of those islands. And that's, as discussed, not taking into consideration the key risk, which is storm surge. So next slide, please. So the key findings from this discussion is that nuclear infrastructure seems to be profoundly unprepared for climate impact. That there is indeed a high probability that reactors and associated high-level spent fuel cells will become unfit for purpose. And the irrational paradox at the heart of this is that nuclear and planned nuclear seeks to provide energy security. The problem is that there's a high probability that will actually produce the reverse, as nuclear becomes increasingly unviable due to climate change impact. Next slide, please. The thing to really consider is that risks to nuclear installations from sea level rise and extreme climate events, they won't be linear. There'll be thresholds at which natural and built environments are exceeded as storm surge and precipitation intensity erodes coastal and inland nuclear flood defenses. So it won't be step change. It'll happen, what may happen more quickly than expected. And next slide, please. in terms of resourcing and money, nuclear industry and government regulatory efforts to mitigate climate risk will involve significantly increased cost for any nuclear construction, operation, waste management, and decommissioning. That much is clear. And the last point is that there does seem to be a high probability that significant nuclear infrastructure will have to be, as the Institute of Mechanical Engineers say, relocated or abandoned. And the last slide, please. So there are two reports which contain the references that are sort of imbued within this discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you. Since I don't want to get our next speakers waiting, and I forgot to mention before that Paul Dorfman will also be in the panel after these last few presentations. So I will not give you questions at the moment, but I will give you them later. And now I will introduce our next speaker. And he is also from the States, and this will be Edwin Lyman. Dr. Edwin Lyman is an internationally recognized expert on nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism, as well as nuclear power safety and security. He is currently the Director of Nuclear Power Safety in the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He also is a member of the Institute of Nuclear Material Management and has testified numerous times before the United States Congress and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And Dr. Lyman has also co-authored a critically acclaimed book, Fukushima, the Story of a Nuclear Disaster. And in March of this year, he authored the study on assessing the safety, security, and environmental impacts of non-light water nuclear reactors, titled Advanced Isn't Always Better. And since in Estonia, the discussion has been around different reactor generations and designs, then he will now give us a very brief overview of what are these advanced designs and what are the possible benefits and drawbacks. So if Edwin is with us and we got the technical side working, then over to you.
Thank you. How's my sound?
Sounds good.
All right, I'm going to try sharing my screen now. Let's see. Okay. See it?
Yeah, you can do the slideshow. Yes, perfect.
Yes, great. All right, well, thank you for having me today, and I'd like to discuss the results of my study, which I call Advanced Isn't Always Better. Here in the United States, as well as many other countries in the world, they are many advocates are becoming enthusiastic about what's are sometimes called advanced reactors. These are really primarily reactors that do not use water as a coolant compared to the operating fleet of water-cooled reactors. And the enthusiasm and hype is reaching a fever pitch here in the US, and I understand in Estonia, as well as other countries around the world, are the recipients of lobbying campaigns by vendors who are seeking to sell a variety of different types of reactors. So I really want to take a deeper look at the claims being made for some of these technologies and see if something really has changed in the many decades since these designs were first proposed. Is there really anything new here that I'm missing that means there's a real future for these exotic reactor types? So the report we put out in March of this year looked at primarily safety and security, proliferation, and waste issues associated with these so-called advanced reactors, and the link is there if you want to take a look at the report. So the main objective is to really compare the risks and benefits of non-light water reactors in comparison to LWRs. Is there something fundamentally better about going to a new type of reactor that has much less or no operating experience in the world? And is that really the future of nuclear power? Are light water reactors a dead end? I also looked at what are the realistic timelines safely deploying a new reactor technology at a large scale. As you know, there's a lot of urgency to addressing the impending threat of climate change, as we heard, and there's a lot of advocacy for nuclear power as a solution. And as a result, many of these reactor developers are claiming that they can take a design essentially that's only on paper and have it commercially deployed reliably and safely at a vast scale around the world in the next decade or two. And is that really a safe and practical and possible thing to do? And really what I'm trying to do is counter all the misleading information that is being promoted by these developers who are really trying to get private capital and public money to help subsidize them. And that's what the game is really all about. It's an advertising battle at this point. It's a public relations battle. What is the technical substance behind that? So I did a number of evaluation criteria. That safety, obviously the fundamental resistance to accidents of the designs, and also security, which is what are their potential vulnerabilities to terrorist attacks. I looked at what's called sustainability, and this is often a big argument for moving which do these different types of reactors have any benefits in reducing or eliminating long-lived nuclear waste, primarily the transuranic elements, that's plutonium and heavier, and do they improve the efficiency of using mined uranium so that you have to use less, you have to mine less to generate the same amount of electricity? And one aspect of that is whether thorium can be practically and efficiently and safely used to replace the use of uranium in the nuclear fuel cycle through the breeding of the uranium-233 isotope. I also looked at the nuclear proliferation terrorism risk. It's always a big issue in the forefront. Some of these designs say they're proliferation resistant, but in fact, some of them would use different types of nuclear materials than what water reactors use that may be more interesting to a state or a terrorist group seeking to build a crude nuclear weapon. The report didn't look at other aspects that are being pushed for nuclear applications, for instance, using them in non-power applications, and also economics, although it's critically important. There are too many variables to really say anything that useful about the relative economics of these designs. So in the US, we have the federal government has been persuaded to provide large subsidies to a number of nuclear reactor developers to build demonstration reactors. In particular, sorry, how's my sound? I think I may turn my video off.
Yeah, we can try that. It's understandable, but yeah. Without the video, it's even better, I think.
Yeah. We have the Natrium, which is the sodium-cooled fast reactor being developed by TerraPower, which is a company founded by Bill Gates. There are high-temperature gas-cooled reactors, in particular the X-Energy XC100, which is a pebble bed gas-cooled reactor, very similar in concept to the test reactors in Germany that didn't operate all that well in the 70s and 80s. And then there are molten salt reactors, including what's called the terrestrial energy integral molten salt reactor. These are reactors that have liquid fuels instead of solid fuels, where the nuclear material is dissolved in. So water reactors use low enriched uranium, typically are now less than 5% uranium-235. That's a material that cannot be directly used in a nuclear weapon. If you want to produce a nuclear weapon, you have that enriched level of low enriched uranium, you're going to have to find an enrichment plant, increase the enrichment. But most non-light water reactors use a higher assay low enriched uranium, that is above 10%, sometimes near 20% uranium-235. That is regarded also as low enriched uranium by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. It is not subject to the same level of safeguards as highly enriched uranium, which is clearly directly weapons usable. But in fact, not only is it not commercially available in short supply, although it is impractical for use in a nuclear weapon directly, it's not impossible to use it, and therefore it requires greater security than the light water reactor LEU. And some developers want to reprocess their spent fuel or to use plutonium obtained from other reactors, spent fuel after reprocessing it. That takes the proliferation terrorism risks to a whole new level. And some reactor designs want to use thorium cycle, in which case the only way you can do that is by breeding another isotope called uranium-233, which again is a weapons usable isotope comparable to plutonium. So these designs generally are going to increase proliferation terrorism risks by virtue of the materials in their fuel cycles. I've summarized a whole range of different designs in this table, where the reds, oranges, and yellows are really worse characteristics than light water reactors, and you see that there are more reds, oranges, and yellows than there are greens and blues. So overall, I didn't find much to like. And some of the key observations is that this idea of sustainability, well, light water reactors, it is true, they waste a lot of uranium. Most of the mined uranium ends up in the depleted uranium at an enrichment plant and is a waste product. Well, can you do better with advanced designs? Well, in theory, a fast reactor, for example, can, depending on how you operate it, can improve on uranium utilization, but mostly if you go to a fuel cycle with reprocessing and breeding plutonium. If you don't do that, such as the Natrium fast reactor, that is the Bill Gates design, which would use high assay LEU and not reprocess its spent fuel, you actually go in the other direction. And that design is going to require at least or nearly 3 times the amount of mined uranium to generate the same amount of electricity as a light water reactor. And you can only do better if you develop new fuels, which will take a significant campaign, and it's not at all clear they can do better. Now, high temperature gas cooled reactors have certain safety features which may improve on their safety, but that hasn't been fully demonstrated. And even if they do have some fundamental safety advantages, they're going to have potential safety disadvantages overall, because the designers want to take credit for that design safety by reducing safety margins elsewhere. For instance, the strength of the containment building that would protect the public in the event of a fuel damage. So I don't want to take too much more time, but generally fast reactors, in addition to not being uranium efficient if they don't reprocess and breed, which again has proliferation risks, they are generally less safe. The developers of fast reactors are trying to turn the safety vulnerabilities on upside down and try to make virtues out of flaws, and I don't buy it. There are so many aspects of fast reactors that have questionable safety aspects, including the potential for a Chernobyl-like positive reactivity insertion if the sodium coolant boils. Gas-cooled reactors, although designers claim the fuel has its own containment, in fact, the fuel itself is not nearly as robust as some people are claiming. Some say it's meltdown proof, it's indestructible. In fact, nothing is meltdown proof or indestructible, and TRISO fuel has certain flaws which could be a problem in certain accidents. And finally, molten salt reactors, where the fuel itself is a liquid. So developers claim that means it can't melt down. Does that mean it's safer? No. One, because you need to remove some fission products as the reactor's operating. Different reactors have different degrees of this removal, but a lot of those fission products that usually would stay in the fuel, or you want to stay in the fuel of a solid fueled reactor, are going to be released to the off-gas system of a molten salt reactor. And I can't see how in any way, shape, or form that's a safety advantage over having a solid fuel where you have many barriers before those radioactive materials are released and have to be captured to prevent them from contaminating the environment. That's what I say here. What about the time scale to commercial deployment? Well, in 2017, the Department of Energy itself said that even for the designs they considered the most mature, that is sodium fast reactors and high temperature gas cooled reactors, would still take upwards of 20 years before you could see commercial deployment of these reactors. So that means we're talking the mid 2030s before really you could start to see that. And this assumes that you don't have to do any more prototype testing of these designs, that they were already reliable and safe based on past experience. And in my report, I go through the rationales for why I don't think that's the case. Now, what about molten salt reactors that are considered lower maturity? In that case, the Department of Energy believed that other additional prototypes would be required before you could deploy. And you're not talking about being able to actually commercially deploy them reliably until the 2050s. So not very useful timescale for combating climate change in any significant way. And the deceptive messaging is frustrating because it really is misleading. Meltdown proof, walk away safe, reactors that consume spent fuel. They're all slogans that were cooked up by communications firms trying to help these vendors sell their product. Instead of making up things that aren't true, the industry really should focus on its fundamental problems and why, and make a case based on the facts, why it believes significant public and private investment are needed to turn these designs into reality. If they have such a good story to tell, why do they have to make things up? That's what I wonder. Number of conclusions, I've already really gone over these, but I don't believe that the non-light water reactors in general, any of them have any significant overall advantages in safety and security and proliferation resistance that would really justify the amount of interest and money that's being put toward them now. I certainly believe that nuclear power and designs can be improved, but the way this is happening now is not a recipe for success, in my opinion. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much. Estonians are notorious for being very shy on asking questions, but I will show the way by asking one, and others can follow up on Facebook in the video. So could you explain a bit more about this walk away safe? What does it mean and why it's problematic? Because we have heard that in the Estonian discussion before.
Yes, well, walk away safe basically is the idea that if you have an accident where you lose cooling, and that's really the fundamental challenge of nuclear power, is making sure that the fuel is cooled at all times so it doesn't overheat. In theory, you could have reactors that have passive systems. So instead of having to have pumps driven by electricity to force water into the core if you have a problem with your ordinary cooling system, All right. So hopefully my sound will be okay. So if you have, let's say, a very small reactor that doesn't generate heat at a high rate, and it can, and it's small enough so that it has a high surface area, then in theory you might have something which is passively safe, and you can cool it without having to have these pumps and motors forcing coolant through the core. But the problem is that then you're relying on natural forces like convection and gravity, and those aren't necessarily the strongest driving forces. So you can't guarantee that is going to be there all the time. You may be able to use it in certain circumstances, but it's not always going to save you. So you can't take full credit for that. And the idea that you're never going to need an operator on site to have to do something in an emergency is just a fantasy. And that became clear with, let's say, the new scale design. That's actually a small modular light water reactor that's being certified here in the United States, and they are actively trying to sell their design abroad. They bill that as walkaway safe, but in fact, it's been shown now that there are potential instabilities in that reactor that may require operator actions to prevent it from melting down under certain circumstances. In fact, those very same natural forces that they rely on for safety can actually make things worse under those circumstances.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And for those very interested in this report, it's titled "Advanced Isn't Always Better." It's you can find it from the site of the Union of the Concerned Scientists, and I highly recommend people to read it if they're very interested in these new designs. And we will move on to our next and last speaker for these presentation rounds for a very quick overview of the Estonian National Nuclear Energy Working Group. And it's presented by Reelika Runnel, who is a counselor for nuclear affairs at Estonian Embassy in Vienna, Austria. And also she is the Estonian permanent representation to the International Atomic Energy Agency, and also the coordinator of the Estonian National Nuclear Energy Working Group. So if you can give us a 10-minute overview, that would be superb. And then we will continue with the panel discussion that people have been waiting for.
Thank you, Matis. I'll try to be brief. First, I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay, I hope it's visible.
We see it nicely.
Okay, thank you. So I will give you an overview of our nuclear energy working group's activities. In this presentation, I will first provide you some background information just to give you an overview of where are we standing at the moment in Estonia. And then I will share information about the establishment of our nuclear energy working group and its activities. And finally, I will briefly speak about our international cooperation activities. So as most of you already know, Estonia is a country without nuclear power reactors. And we don't have any spent fuel or high-level radioactive waste or radioactive material production either in Estonia. And main users of the radiation sources are currently medical sector and industry. So at the moment, we do not have any experience with nuclear energy in our country. And the activities related to radiation protection and nuclear safety are organized by the Ministry of Environment, and our regulatory authority, Environmental Board, issues radiation practice licenses, carries out inspections, and has an enforcement power. And Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communications is responsible for the entire energy sector and transport, and as well as for administrating our one and only radioactive waste management and storage facility in Paldiski. Our current position on nuclear energy has been quite neutral. Although Estonia is not operating nuclear power plants itself and has not taken any decisions on the possible use of nuclear energy yet, we believe that every country has a right to decide which low carbon electricity production solutions are best suited to them. And if it becomes evident that nuclear power would be the best solution from a socioeconomic and environmental point of view, in order to achieve our 2050 climate targets, Estonia is ready to consider it. We are not ruling out at the moment any viable solutions that would help us to achieve our climate targets and would help us to ensure our security of supply and support our electricity production in addition to renewables. But at the same time, we have to bear in mind that Estonia currently lacks legislative framework, competent authorities, as well as experts for the establishment of nuclear power plants. And well, according to the Estonian Radiation Act, Parliament has to, first of all, approve the commissioning of a nuclear facility into Estonia. So before making any decisions on nuclear energy, we need thorough political preparatory work and engagement of all relevant stakeholders and members of the public. In addition, we must understand that although the power plant itself could be constructed and operated by the private sector and with their funds, we would still need investments from the state budget in order to establish and maintain the nuclear regulatory infrastructure. And furthermore, maybe the most important aspect is that we must acknowledge the fact that nuclear energy is a long-term commitment that cannot be simply like abandoned overnight if we have already started to use it. So in order to tackle with all of these issues, Ministry of Environment submitted its first memorandum to the government already in December 2019 with a proposal to establish a nuclear energy working group to analyze the possibilities for introduction of nuclear energy in Estonia beyond 2035. But due to the global COVID crisis, the establishment of the working group was temporarily put on hold in 2020, but in April 2021, the working group was officially formed with a decree of Minister of the Environment. And so far, working group meetings have taken place already 4 times. The next meeting is scheduled for January 2022. And all the information on the working group's activities and protocols of the meetings is publicly available on the webpage of the Ministry of Environment. It's currently only in Estonian, but hopefully soon we will manage to translate all of these materials into English as well. So members of the working group are high-level representatives of almost all of the ministries in Estonia. Currently, only 2 ministries do not have a member in the working group, and these ministries are Ministry of Culture and Ministry of Rural Affairs. But if their involvement seems to be necessary, they are going to be engaged as well. The government expects the first results from the working group already by September 2022 in a form of an interim report. And the government also listed those topical issues which should be focused on in this interim report. But I will briefly introduce them on my next slide. But one thing that I would like to stress at the moment is that the interim report will only be a mapping of the current situation in Estonia and will not yet allow a decision to be taken on the use of nuclear energy. So in September 2022, we don't have the full knowledge on all the aspects of nuclear power yet. And according to our current estimations, the working group is ready to present the final report to the government by the second half of 2024. So by that time, we are hoping to conclude like a more like in-depth analysis on all of the aspects of nuclear energy. And the final report is going to formulate those recommendations, whether or under what conditions nuclear power could be introduced in Estonia. And this report shall be based on the International Atomic Energy Agency's guidance document that's called the Milestones Approach, and which lists 19 different infrastructure issues that should be analyzed before a country takes a decision on nuclear energy. In addition, before we present this report to the government, we're planning to invite the International Atomic Energy Agency to review this report and to give their expert's opinion. That's done by this expert mission called INIR mission. So on this slide, you can see the roadmap with an overview of how the topics that are scheduled for interim reports and the timeline for performing this analysis. Well, for example, we are mapping currently our energy sector's needs and developments in our neighboring countries and analyze different nuclear power technologies, their safety aspects and waste streams, and the nuclear power program financing schemes, regulatory requirements, etc. Like many of those aspects have been discussed already today here as well. In 2022, we are conducting an analysis on possibilities of the involvement of the industrial sector into nuclear power program. And we're going to conduct this nuclear security, emergency preparedness and response assessments, and start with a preliminary site survey to identify whether hypothetically constructing a small nuclear power plant and final disposal facility for spent fuel would be possible in Estonia, given our geological conditions. Now, finally, I would like to briefly mention our international cooperation activities. So, although Estonia does not have many nuclear experts, there are plenty available in international organizations and other countries that are willing to provide their assistance to Estonia. And our main cooperation partner on all of the radiation protection related nuclear safety matters since 1992 has been the International Atomic Energy Agency, who has supported us throughout the decades in establishing our radiation protection legal and regulatory framework, and has provided assistance for us on numerous cases. In addition, we are seeking advice from the Finnish regulatory authority STUK, with whom Estonia has long and very good cooperation practice. And we're currently discussing if it would be possible for STUK to review our interim report and provide some feedback and recommendations to our working group on the focus areas. And at a later stage, we would like to involve them into the process as consultants as well. In September, we started talks with the US government representatives on our possibilities to join the US government program called FIRST. And on the 15th and 16th of November, we already had a scoping meeting with the US representatives to define our capacity building goals. And next year, we're hoping to receive already some training for our specialists from United States. So this first program is provides general capacity building on nuclear energy and nuclear safety and security and safeguards matters. So to raise general awareness in countries that lack the nuclear expertise. In addition, we have also had several consultancy meetings with the authorities from France, Japan, Germany, and UK on possible cooperation activities, but well, we haven't taken any concrete action yet. So this concludes my presentation on the Estonian Nuclear Energy Working Group. I thank you for your attention and feel free to ask any questions if you have them. Thank you.
Thank you. And apparently this presentation was so clear that the public has no questions at the moment. So with this, I think it's high time to do the second part of this conference, which is the panel discussion. And in this discussion, we have 3 to 4 members. We'll see by the end of this introduction if the fourth one will join us. But we will have Reelika Runnel, who we just heard. We will have Dr. Paul Dorfman with us again. And then we have Henri Ormus, who is the board member at Fermi Energy, which is a company that develops the possibility of introducing a new generation small modular reactor in Estonia. That is what their homepage says. And also Mr. Ormus has worked for many years in the Finnish Fennovoima company. So he also has some very, very practical hands-on experience. And the fourth panelist should be Marek Strandberg, who is a local Estonian material scientist, politician, and environmentalist, and a journalist. But currently he's not with us. Let's see if he drops in midway through. But I have some questions to start us off, and I will direct them to one of the panelists. And but anybody else can jump in as well. So I know Henri has been waiting for 1.5 hours. So the first question is for you. As the title of this event is SMRs, the Estonian need or distraction. So the question is, can we need something that we seem to be having a hard time getting? So I know that in the distant past, you yourself also had this public view that small reactors are forget them. But now, obviously, you're very much seeing that they're just around the corner. So can you outline why do you feel this way, or what is something that the others have been missing?
Yes, hello everyone from my side. Thank you very much for inviting me this anti-nuclear panel discussion. Yes, you're absolutely correct. 10 years ago, my opinion was that Estonia should not consider SMR. It is a very practical reason, because at that time there was no SMRs actually available for Estonia. Then in the market there was only large reactors, and the large reactors, unfortunately, they are too big to Estonia. So our only hope is SMRs, and I'm really convinced that Estonia needs, and Estonia would benefit from having SMRs in Estonia. There are quite many reasons. I can name a few. Of course, few is the energy security issue. Then the security of supply, that we are importing now about 50% of electricity. Then also, of course, like if we would produce electricity ourselves, we would not need to import, and we would retain the money in the country. So now hundreds of millions of euros go out from Estonia. And then if we would produce in Estonia, this means a lot of taxes to the government and local municipalities, which is also much more than actually the cost of having a regulator, which is quite minor cost compared to the income to the country. And of course, meeting the climate objective. Me as a kind of in heart, I'm kind of an environmentalist also, because I'm from my perspective, I've been kind of fighting for climate change, and I'm also vocal, but I'm doing that from my specialty and my field of expertise point of view. And I really see that the nuclear power is needed. And this is, I'm kind of really happy to hear recently after the COP26 that also the European leaders and many countries' leaders say that we cannot meet the climate targets without nuclear in Europe, at least. So yes.
Do any other panelists want to chip in on this particular question or reflect from the presentations you heard in the previous 1.5 hours? Yes, Paul.
I think it's important that the discussion is not sort of like a pro or sort of anti-nuclear in that sense. Basically, there are sets of evidence that's being presented, and then people can sort of make their mind up. So it's important not to characterize evidence base as being sort of, you know, either pro or anti.
Yeah, fully agree, fully agree. I was just looking, the first 3 presenters were really very anti-nuclear background, and all their posts were, but were in the media only about being anti-nuclear. So kind of had to point that out for our viewers here. But I'm really happy that I'm here, and I heard pretty interesting facts also from presenters, and also Paul, what you pointed out, the sea level rise. Yes, it might be, of course, a problem in some countries, and these need to be taken into account, definitely. Luckily, we haven't checked in Estonia for this Pakri site. This is out of question, and the sites which we've been screening, we of course are taking into account the sea level rise possibility, same like we do currently in Finnish nuclear Henri 1 project, where the site is constructed 5 meters above the sea level.
So I will take the Henri's word, and I agree that currently in Estonia, let's say we have some extreme camps, right? Very pro this technology and very anti. And now the question from this arises, and maybe I will direct this to Reelika, is that who should actually be in charge of educating the general public? Because we have these extreme camps who have to be in these extremes, but who does the middleman work?
Thank you for that question. We see that the government should be the middleman in this question, and this is exactly the reason why the government has established this nuclear energy working group. And so far, this working group has not been very vocal and in communicating with the members of the public. But next year we're going to establish our communication strategy, and we will start like our like activities of sharing this information of our activities, and we're going to probably arrange some events that are meant for members of the public. So far, Fermi Energia has done a very good job in educating members of the public of like different alternatives that are available. But from the government's perspective, we are trying to hold quite this neutral view, and we are also like discussing those more like problematic aspects of nuclear energy, and we are analyzing all those pros and cons, and we are going to make this decision or present our this results to the government based on this analysis, and we'll see that if they are more like pros to nuclear energy, then the working group shall make a recommendation on in this regard. If we see that it would be too expensive, too time-consuming, etc., and we see that there are plenty of other options available, then the decision might be something else. But yeah, but at the moment we see that those nuclear energy working group should be the middleman in these negotiations. Thank you.
Yes, can I comment? Yes, we in Fermi Energy, we fully agree, because we've been seen as an industry, and if we promote, of course we promote what we believe in, and but of course this is seen as let's say not in the eyes of the public, it is not the correct way. Maybe that there need to be scientists, more scientists who are speaking out about this topic, not only us, because of course it's obvious that we've been started this process, we've been kicking it going, and we are the most vocal voice, and we try to educate the people and give the information through the summer school for the students, and through the conference and to the seminars, but of course it is very welcome, and also what Madis is doing. Of course, you need to balance different views, and this is the discussion what is really needed in Estonia. We fully agree. So thanks for inviting here. Yes.
Paul, did you have a comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's in a sense, there's been a lot of rhetoric. There's been a lot of rhetoric from sort of concerted rhetoric during COP25 and absolutely post COP26 about nuclear. But I think it's important to keep the rhetoric, the talk, in the context of the evidence base, so that total investment in new renewable electricity exceeded $300 billion last year. That's 17 times reported investment for nuclear. A record 256 gigawatts of non-hydro, and I emphasize non-hydro renewables, were added to the world's power grids in 2020. And that plays against 0.4 gigawatts for nuclear. Since 2009, the ELCO, the localized cost estimates for utility solar, dropped by 90%, wind dropped by 70%, and nuclear increased by 33%. So there's a sort of strange discontinuity between the reality of the energy transition and this idea that somehow nuclear is going to come along and sort of somehow save it. Now, Lazard, so you're talking the market here, per megawatt hour, 29 euros per megawatt hour solar, 33 euros land wind, 52 euros CCS gas, 94 euros per megawatt hour coal, 145 euros per megawatt hour large nuclear. So there's this, I think we need to keep the discussion in the context of the evidence base here.
I would comment on the prices. Yeah, your numbers are pretty high there. And
they're not my numbers. They're not my numbers.
Yes,
they're
yes,
Lazard. Yeah.
But in Finland, the nuclear, there's two new builds. One is the Olkiluoto 3, which is getting ready after long delays and after also big cost overruns. This will produce much cheaper energy than what you said there, and this will have for 80 years clean energy, or at least 60. And also Fennovoima Hankikivi project, where I am, the target is the price target is 50 euros per megawatt hour. Of course, this is the reality. We'll see what the reality will bring, and the estimates for the SMRs are in that range. They're 40, 50, 60. But of course, before we do not build one, we do not know, and I agree. That's why we need to build, and this is the development and the price that it needs to be paid. You need to have faith in and really do this development phase. And once you've done this, then the price goes down. This was proven in France when they did the whole 59 now, I don't know, was it 60 reactors. They made them pretty much similar. So it was copy pasting, and that was efficient construction. We see in UAE, in Emirates currently, 4 large reactors built on time, copy paste one another, each other, very successfully. We don't know, I'm not aware of the price there, of course, but the serial production, this is the kind of also the promise, of course. We do not know yet whether it will realize, but of course, if the price tag will go very high, then there's no business case. But looking at the current electricity prices and understanding that in Europe, we need to shut down all the dispatchable, or not all, but all the coal, then the gas needs to go out, then Estonian oil shale goes out. So where the energy comes, we see already what's happening in the electricity markets. Yeah.
I will give you interesting things, but we had a question from the public, so I need to seize it. And it's also actually for Henri. It's about this question that you mentioned, the Finnish nuclear capacity is high. So the question is from a viewer is that why does Fermi Energy think that they can compete with this Finnish nuclear capacity, building a plant also in Estonia? So wouldn't it be more difficult because the Finns are over the sea and they are still exporting energy, nuclear energy also to Estonia? So wouldn't it be more economical to build more cables? What's your quick response? And then I have some
very quickly.
Other questions.
It is stupid to not build our own and give the money out from the country. But this is the thing. So that's very simple. We can do it. Estonia can do. We have very bright people, and if many countries have done it in the history, Estonia can also do it. That's not a question. It's a question of will.
Okay, and that's a good question to transition, because even before we talk about the numbers and the euros per megawatt, the question is, does the public want it? And here's the question, that how will the public be involved in this question? So I know that Fermi Energy has done these public opinion polls where if I'm not mistaken, number 1 preference is, I think, wind, then it's solar, and third is nuclear at this point, something like this. You can correct me. And then has been these anti-nuclear petitions with over 1,000 signatures gone to the parliament and so on. So people are doing something, but what's the right way to get people involved? Maybe Paul can bring the example of other countries. I've heard that referendums are very bad because this will split people in two, and there will be no more discussion. So let's go Paul, Reelika, and then Henri. Sorry, I muted you because you can put the volume down so you don't have such much echo.
Okay, is that okay? Does that work? Yeah, I was involved in the development of the European Energy Dialogue, which is taken forward by the European Union. Worked with the UK Ministry of Defence on participatory democracy, on how to decommission the reactors, and also wrote national health guidance on participatory democracy and how to make health decisions. And if there's one thing that's true, is that you need to do involvement, but if you do involvement, you need to do it properly. You need to take time over it. You mustn't force people's views, you mustn't force views down their throats. And you have to be patient about how things go. It's actually quite a relatively difficult thing to do, but it's really, really worthwhile. And if you do it properly, you really do save time later on. Referendums, yeah, I mean, we all know about what's happened in Brexit. You're just talking across the trench. The whole point is to create a safe space where people can actually share the evidence, look at it, and try to come to a reasoned conclusion.
Reelika, please.
Hey, thank you. I completely agree with Paul, and And I would like to add that from Estonian government side, from our nuclear energy working group side, we are planning to launch a survey on how people in Estonia see nuclear energy and what kind of fears are they're having that are associated with nuclear energy, and to see, well, this general opinion of our members of the public. Although Fermi Energia is conducting those kind of surveys on regular basis, but we are doing something similar at the government level as well now, and we put some additional questions there for people to consider. And based on that, the working group will plan its actions and interactions with the members of the public, and then we get the idea what kind of like focus areas there are that should be dealt with firsthand, and what are the main interests for members of the public. But Estonia is a democratic country, and we have declared that on our energy-related matters, we are going to be as open and transparent as possible, and we engage stakeholders and well, members of the public and our scientific community into decision-making process. Thank you.
Yes, to comment, it's a $1 million question. It is very complicated, as Paul said. Also, there is very different like target groups or stakeholders with who we need to have the dialogue, of course. And we need to have education first, of course, that the kids already in the school would understand a little bit about nuclear. Then different public debates, different seminars, different discussion forums. I think the best is when people gather together and they can actually face-to-face talk and express their concerns. And we need to have these, of course, much more. So we need to let them talk their concerns, and then also we need to have the specialists from all over the world, obviously, to answer their concerns. It's not that only Fermi Energia, because we know that this is not so good if only one party is communicating. So yeah, there's no good answer to this question, but we need to do a lot. Yeah, that is clear. That is clear. Yeah.
And let me reintroduce Mr. Marek Strandberg, who has now joined us as well. And the question for the big round was that how should the general public be involved in these matters of nuclear debates? And I know you have been writing on this issue in the news for a long time now. So what are your
30 years, actually 30 years. Well, yeah, it's main thing is, of course, to make the difference between the education and propaganda, because there is a very slippery road to be in the area called propaganda instead of education. And what I see clearly today, because since 1992 we had in Rio de Janeiro the agreement between the many of countries about the biodiversity significance, which is actually the basement for this green turn or green revolution now, or however you call it. And surprisingly, keep in mind that in Estonia, in this period, 30 years, roughly 400 plus people are died and newborn already. But again, the education still doesn't include enough of understanding what is the biosphere, what is the climate, and all the relations. And now we are in position to try to provide in very short time for Estonian people so-called education about the nuclear energy. It's practically impossible. You can provide only the propaganda, because that's what happens in the world today. So that the companies are in situation that producing the nuclear reactors, actually the business is not very good over the time. Just let's remember, in 1960s, there was the hope that in the world will be, let's say, 10,000 of nuclear reactors. Nothing like that happened. 400 plus 500, perhaps not more. And there is something crucially non-consistent in this business, because it's very difficult to imagine, just thinking a little bit, how it's possible to provide the most of the energy in the world needed from nuclear reactors. Because the nuclear reactor itself is not the part of circular economy. Because in very short time, so that in 50 years, all those materials the reactor is made are impossible to use further. It's impossible to recycle. And that's not the business what we can conduct in the world when we have to introduce more and more, let's say, the recycling possibilities, reuse possibilities. And in this point, there is necessary to understand what is the realistic fraction, realistic share of possible nuclear energy in the pool of all ways to produce the energy. And so, there is certain limit, so that we have to be clear. It's not universal solution, just keeping in mind the understanding what happens in the world today.
Yeah, and does anybody want to comment?
Yes, I can comment, of course. And nuclear people never say that this is the only solution. We are saying that this is one part of the solution that is needed to really tackle the huge global issue. And I personally agree that nuclear can be considered as transitional energy if we consider maybe 100 years. But in a short term being 50 years, nuclear is definitely needed. Yeah.
Paul, unmute yourself. Yes.
Okay. The problem is that it's too costly and it'll come too late. Nuclear will eat all of the pies. We're only going to have a certain amount of resources. Climate change is upon us and it will cost. Now, nuclear is simply so expensive that if you go down the nuclear route, you're not going to have the resources, the money, the finance. The market has already decided. It's only via public finance that you know, command and control countries and a few other crazy places like the UK. But the key to it really is that it won't come in time. All of the nuclear construction, both SMR development and large Gen 3, so-called Gen 4, are going to be way too late to help us with the key challenge that we have, which is decarbonization by a certain time. If we don't do it by a certain time, we've lost.
And that's a question, and Henri can be the first to answer this, which should have been my last question anyway, is that if Estonia as a small country has to choose which way to go in looking for these energy futures, and I don't think we can go in every direction, then what is the direction to take? I know the government is saying that we should go to every direction and look at every possibility, but if you had to choose like what to abandon or not invest in, then what would it be? So Henri, if you're saying that nuclear is the way to go, what is some other direction that you then wouldn't go into in terms of energy?
Well, I think we know in Estonia we have three clean choices. It's nuclear, solar, and wind. Solar we don't have during winter. Wind, it's intermittent, and it requires a lot of storage, which is very expensive also. So in my opinion, we need all the clean sources. Regarding Paul's comment about nuclear being slow, like if we take, for example, large-scale offshore wind projects, these are 10, 15 years at least. So it's the same timescales. So no large-scale energy production installation is fast. And we know that how much fossil fuels we are still burning. So the challenge to increase the speed of construction for every clean source, it's like immense. And we need to increase the wind production tens of times, solar tens of times, but also nuclear, because dispatchable energy is really needed, because we see the problems in the grids when we lose a lot of the dispatchable energy. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, if I can comment shortly. The question is, what is the, let's say, the set of skills the workers has to apply to produce some energy conversion device is one thing. And the second thing is about what is the, let's say, the pattern of creation of entropy in case of you apply certain type of way to produce the energy. Obviously, if you do that from the fossil fuels, it's huge amount of entropy generated in different forms, in heat, in carbon dioxide, whatever. And now it's questionable what is the residue of the entropy in case if you start to generate the energy from the nuclear sources, the fission sources. And in this point, there is significant difference. In case if we use the solar energy, so that in form of wind or water or direct solar light, there is obvious that all those entropy components stay from us 150 million kilometers in the nuclear synthesis reactions in the sun. In case if you start to concentrate the fission ores to material which is usable in the nuclear reactors, then quite clearly this entropy which is generated, residue of energy generation, stays on the Earth. And that's in wider scale, not the approach. We can say that, okay, at least we can continue with the same amount of nuclear reactors. There is impossible to increase the nuclear generation of energy tens of times. It makes no sense. It just makes no sense. It's economically not effective. It's environmentally strange, and therefore it's not the thing to concentrate our ideas to start to generate more and more energy. In comparison, in average, 8 billion people on the Earth, we, let's say, per person, we continuously consume roughly 3 kilowatts of energy, mostly coming from the non-renewable sources, fossil fuel sources. Now, can we say that we can increase that? Obviously not, because the rest of the world, the rest of the biosphere works in a way that if we take off, let's say, the amount of, let's say, the biostructures from this biosphere, which weighs roughly 300 billion tons in form of carbon, then the part of the human weight in this system consumes only 18 watts of energy continuously because of the structure. We are in the limit that we cannot increase the amount of energy we consume every day. And this point, there makes no sense to try to promote the nuclear energy as the way to increase the energy consumption. It makes no sense. It just makes no sense. And we have seen the business model applied in Finland for the, now in next week, hopefully, as they hope the Olkiluoto or the next reactor will start. This business model is completely horrible. It's not the business, it's just political decision to make the nuclear power there. And I think so that it's our possible future, one of our possible future when we choose the path of the nuclear energy. That's quite obvious. We have to learn from the.
We're getting very philosophical in the evening. Thank you for that. Obviously, the discussions can go on and on and on, but our time is limited. So, Reelika or Paul, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap it up for today's small conference?
Well, I have just a brief comment that naturally, and considering all the sources of energy available for Estonia, in our path to achieving this climate targets, we're going to have to look at the whole life cycle of those energy production needs, from mining to decommissioning, and this goes for the solar panels and for the wind turbines as well. And just like nuclear energy, they as well need the resources, and like there are mining activities involved and decommissioning, and they produce waste. They're not like radioactive, or they don't have like this toxicity like the spent fuel has, but there are problems, and we're gonna have to view this whole life cycle and all those pros and cons of this different means of electricity production. Thank you.
If I may, very short comment, really short. What is necessary to do is really, it's necessary to make fast decisions about the nuclear or non-nuclear, and why. Every country has to make that kind of decision. And that's because over last 5 years, even more, the central banks issued so huge amount of new money, billions, no, trillions of dollars or euros. And it stays there in the accounts without of use. Why? Because the countries, the governments have not made the decisions what to do for the green revolution, the change. And therefore the decision is necessary, because if the decision exists, there is the possibility via commercial banks, via investment banks, to increase this trillion to up to 50 or 100 trillion of real money to make this turn as fast as possible.
I would like to give a quick word for Henri and then Paul to finish it up. Then I think it's fine.
Yes, maybe a few remarks about nuclear, this whole fuel cycle or whole life cycle emissions. So the recent UN Economic Commission Forum study found that nuclear actually has the lowest CO2 through the whole life cycle. So this is pretty clear. The other thing is the resource consumption, which is kind of mentioned quite several times here, that nuclear consumes resources. But if we compare to other electricity production means, then actually the nuclear has almost the smallest natural resource consumption per produced electricity. Thank you.
I think in that study, the UNECI study, is now open for discussion. And this question about CO2 and nuclear will be a long-standing one. I don't think it's the last word in it. But in terms of the fundamental realities of where we are, in the European Union, renewables for the first time overtook fossil fuels to become the primary source of power in 2020, and also the first year that non-hydro renewables generated more power than nuclear in Europe. And if one's looking at a way forward, one looks at what is best practice. And at the moment, in terms of the energy transition, Germany does seem to be where it's at. The largest, strongest economy in Europe is going nuclear free, will diminish its coal, says the new government, by 2030, and retain a very, very high standard of living. So I think that one needs to look elsewhere for constructing models about the energy transition. Thanks.
And with this note, I would like to thank all the presenters, the panelists, of course, and the audience who was with us the whole time. And I'm sure that these discussions will continue in Estonia and around the world about if SMRs are the need that we can't do without, or are they distractions. And hopefully these discussions will be balanced. Hopefully today's small conference also contributed to this balance. I wouldn't say it's anti-nuclear, it's very critical about this topic, because there are points that are very critical and we need to discuss them. And with this, I thank you all and all the best to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.